Alright, here are the pots we're going to reuse. And here are the tea seedlings. Now, I harvested these, I harvested the seed for these back in October of 2014, and today is July 7th, 2015. So it's been quite a number of months since I've harvested these seeds. Of course, the winter in Georgia makes these seeds, or the plants, go dormant for a number of months, and I saw these guys germinate in late April to early May. So since then they've grown up just about 3 inches. We can see some very solid, healthy looking new growth on them. These seedlings have been kept in about a maybe 75% shade environment, and that's where I'm going to keep them for a little bit longer, even if after I transplant them into these gallon pots. My main tool for today is a fork. The fork helps me to pick apart individual seedlings and without doing a lot of damage to the roots. If I were to go in there with a knife or just to pull them up, it'd be a little bit more difficult. So the prongs of the fork help me to distribute the forces and the pressures around the root system so I don't sever them. These are the weeds that I weeded out of the tray, and these weeds grew even on my back porch. So weed seeds are extremely persistent. So this is our mix. About 50% of our Goodness Grows soilless mix, which is primarily ground up pine bark, and then another 50% of a native soil, which I dug out kind of from a lower lying drainage canal. It looks like it's mostly, when I was digging it up, mostly sand, which is going to be ideal for the tea plants, because sand, being the largest soil particle, will give the most or the highest degree of drainage, which, from what I've read and heard about tea plants, is exactly what they need. Tea plants need sharp drainage. They're extremely sensitive to sitting in moisture. So what we're going to do is fill up the pot about 80% of the way. And come in here, and here we go. Here's a nice seedling that's separated from everything. I dig down with the fork near the base of the roots, and at the same time I'm going to pull up in the stem gently and raise with the fork, trying to keep as much of the roots intact as I can. And these roots are probably a little bit more mature than I would have liked them. I should have transplanted these seedlings maybe a month or two ago, because then when they're transplanted there's less roots to injure. Now, I think some of these roots, it's hard to say if they're coming from the tea plant. I think they are. So look at that. That's an extensive root system on that type of seedling. So if I would have transplanted these 1 or 2 months ago, I could expect the roots maybe to be half this amount, which is about roughly half the amount of disturbance. So this plant is going to see some sort of a setback from transplant shock, just because I'm dislodging all of these connections that the roots had in the tray. It's going to have to dedicate a lot of its energy to rebuilding those root connections and the micro root hairs that have been severed or disconnected. I'm going to take a little bit off the top. I didn't know the roots were going to be that extensive. And actually, in nature, if this seed germinated naturally, these roots would be found along the top, a couple inches of the soil, something like that, spreading out horizontally. In a pot, they have minimal horizontal area to spread out, but I'm going to try to mimic that by keeping the roots relatively near the surface. and then hopefully they'll adapt. I'm getting quite a lot of mosquito irritation here. Now, as you can see, the roots are kind of spread along the top layer of the soil. I'm just gonna, with my hand, scoop in a little extra layer. I don't want to bury them too deep. It's about maybe a ½ inch deep right there, and lightly pack it in. Now I can already tell using this type of mixture where it's half soilless pine bark, half native soil, it's definitely heavier, and it's already packed tighter. Usually if it was just pine bark, I'd have to kind of go around and press out the air, but this is already pretty solid. So I'm just going to leave it just like that. Let's do a couple more. Lightly pack it in there. We want the water to be able to percolate through the pot so it's not sitting in and around the roots causing an anaerobic environment. So we can see this one is much less developed. Take a look at that root system. Still very nice though. I believe this main central one is called a taproot. It's that first root that comes down, and then as this plant develops, we're going to get the roots to spread out horizontally. So since this one was headed kind of downwards, I'm just going to try to put it in the exact same position it was before. Fill in around it. There we go. Now, I estimate I have about 30 in here, and so you can see that this activity, even for roughly 30 to 50 seedlings, would take a while. So it's good if you have some music playing, if you have an iPod, if you listen to podcasts. Shout out to the World Tea Podcast, TJ. I've been listening to that. It's been very entertaining, and actually, let's check it out. I have it queued up now in my iPod, but it's very fitting that as I'm potting up my tea, I'm listening to tea. World Tea Podcast. He's talking about the World Tea Expo 2015. I was there, and I'm only 3 minutes into that one. And this episode was released just, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. Maybe 3 weeks ago. So I'm looking forward to finishing that podcast. Thanks, TJ, for allowing me to listen to tea while I work. Let's do another one. A little fork here. There we go. Again, not a whole lot of extensive roots on that one, but we're getting a lot of the lateral roots to come out. Ideally, the seedling would have been transplanted before those lateral roots started forming like that. Again, just to minimize the amount of damage when I'm transplanting them. In my experience and what I've heard, transplanting, whether it's out into the ground or repotting the tea, is one of the most, I don't want to say dangerous, but critical times for a tea plant. It's when a lot of things can go wrong, and you might experience some tea losses. When I transplanted some cuttings I had made just about a month ago, I lost roughly 5% of those, and I believe it was, there's a lot of stresses that happen during a transplant, and one of them was a change in humidity and light, and couple that with some lost roots, and that's too much stress to overcome. Okay, here's a fourth one. You see the seed is still hanging on there. Looks really good. A lot of good coloration. No insect or pest damage. Ripped leaf there. I don't know what that's about. But again, pretty extensive root forming. Oh, one thing I do want to mention with these is a lot of guides will talk about when you're germinating tea seeds to bury them about an inch deep. But with these, and what I saw in the wild when I saw some tea plants growing unattended, was that I found a lot of times seedlings would just spring up like this around the mother bush, sometimes hundreds of them, and no one was planting those seeds. They were just germinating around on the top layer of the soil, or minimal contact to the soil. So that's what I did with this tray. I was kind of inspired by a man named Masanobu Fukuoka, who was really trying to come up with a more sustainable way of farming by decreasing the amount of steps that the farmer had to do and mimicking nature. So in nature, the seeds fall on the top of the earth. Sometimes they're buried by critters, but I wanted to see how that worked. And this tray was that result. So instead of burying the seeds, I filled it up with soil, and then I broadcast the seed around the top layer. You can see a lot of these ungerminated seed pods. They're just resting right on top. Same thing over here. And some of them are hollow and they're never going to germinate, but we had a pretty good germination percentage and a lot of plants did very well. One thing that I noticed though is even on my back porch, when 15 feet off the ground, some type of pest is digging through these and eating the seeds and stealing them. And especially if they're not buried, if they're sitting right across the top, they're a much easier target for a meal. But I was happy that my experiment worked out and I had a very good germination by not even burying the seeds. By the way, Masanobu Fukuoka wrote a book called One Straw Revolution. He worked as a plant pathologist for the government of Japan in and around the World War II era, I believe, especially pre-World War II, and he saw he witnessed the change that Japan was making from a more of a intensive agrarian lifestyle to more of a Western industrial model of agriculture. And he more or less had a philosophical stance that going the industrial route was not in the best interest of the people, nor the environment. Let's do one more. Nice root system. Again, I'm going to try to keep that intact as much as I can. I don't want to disturb the roots. So you can see that's a good color contrast between the medium that the plant is coming from, and then it's definitely lighter around the area that it's going into. The lightness is caused by the native soil, which is mostly sand, I believe, that I've added to it. So the plant is going to have to transition into that switch up. It's definitely going to be different. I believe it's going to be a slight challenge for the plant, but I hope they really react well. Now, another thing that I want to mention too is I'm going to store these in a shady-ish location, trying to mimic a location that's about 75% shade, which is where they're coming from, until they're, I don't know, maybe 8 to 12 inches tall. Then I'll gradually move them into the sun. But the water, the soil moisture is going to be different in this mixture. The surface area of this mixture is so much greater because the particle size of the sand is so much smaller than the straight up ground pine bark. So when I water this, I believe this mixture is going to stay moist much longer than the pure pine bark soilless medium. So, you know, if these were in the soilless medium, I might water them twice a week, but in this, maybe it's going to be once a week. But that's another thing that I'm really interested in to find out, is how long this stays moist compared to, like I said, the traditional soilless ground pine bark that we use. And if I would want to be really scientific about it, I would pot half of these into my custom mixture, 50% native, 50% pine bark, and then the other half into pine bark only. Just finished potting up the tea seedlings. Took me about 2 hours. We have roughly 10, 20, 30, 52, and then very weak early ones there. So a little over 50 seedlings in about 2 hours. I had to go back and refill up my soil. But this is what 50 looks like, and I'm glad and excited to watch them grow, and hopefully we don't have much loss from this transplant. So now it's time to move them into the shade. Alright, I just wanted to quick go over this at the end of the day. This was the fabric that I was going to place the seedlings on. Originally that was my plan, but it's quite open here, and it gets full sun for at least 6 hours. Not good for seedlings. So if we go back into this shadier forested area, right around the corner, there are my seedlings, right under the shade of the cedar tree, and it gets dappled shade. We see some nandina around here, and this one's going to give it a nice shady environment for these to grow up, and as they get taller and larger, I can move them out into the sun. But for now, I'm going to sit down right here in the shade and continue growing in an ideal environment, especially as they adapt towards the stress of getting transplanted. Being in the shade will reduce the amount they get dehydrated. Their ability to uptake water and move it through their tissues is compromised due to the transplant. So being in the shade, they're going to have a better chance to rejuvenate, and once they're kicking again, then I can expose them to some more sun. Now the last thing I'm going to do is water in the seedlings. This is important generally when transplanting anything, to water it before and after, since the roots are exposed to air for a period of time and there can be drying out that occurs. And especially since I mentioned that due to the transplant stress, the ability for the plants to absorb water through the roots is compromised. So we need to make sure that there's an ample water supply. Like I stated before, since I'm using this 50-50 mix of native soil and ground pine bark, I believe I'm going to have to maybe water these once a week since they're in the shade. If these were in the full sun, way different story. Maybe once every day, once every other day, just because the sun would evaporate the water out of the pot so much quicker.